Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. In light of the recent discussions around processing capacity, Laurence Shalloo joins us on this week's episode to compare the Irish seasonal milk supply curve versus the flatter milk supply curve we see on the continent.
Last October, we published a report called The Analysis of the Irish Dairy Sector Post-Quota. And I suppose it was, a collaboration between Teagasc, CIT and UCC. And I suppose the authors were Declan O'Connor, Lugigo Sela and Fiona Thorne. So just, I suppose, a little bit about the report. The report, the idea behind it was to look at what has happened in the dairy industry before quotas were removed to when quotas were removed up to 2019. And we wanted to look at what has happened in terms of milk output, in terms of profitability, in terms of milk price, in terms of seasonality. And I suppose our big focus was to look at, a lot of this information is out there in the public domain, but it wasn't really, I suppose, all put together in one report. And that was part of the focus of our report.
And looking then, what are the main findings of the report and what were you chasing or looking at, Laurence?
I suppose, there was a number of things we wanted to look at. We wanted to look at how well Irish farmers, or how do Irish farmers compare in terms of milk price, in terms of profitability to some EU counterparts and indeed to New Zealand. That was the first thing. But we also wanted to look at, I suppose, and get into a little bit behind the details around why there's differences in, for example, milk price. What is the impact on, for example, seasonality on milk price? What is the impact of the investment that has been made on Irish farms, and indeed in processors, to build the additional processing capacity? What has that impact been on the milk price that gets paid? So we wanted to be able to, get an understanding to look at, are we still right to stay with the model that we have, which is seasonal for cow's calf to match the demand between the animals and the supply in terms of grass growth, or should we be moving away from that? That was part of our overall objective.
And looking then to milk price, where are we in the league if we compare ourselves to those European counterparts and indeed New Zealand?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's really, I suppose, probably one of the main findings from the report was that, I suppose, if we look at over the period 2015 to 2019, and if we look at the period, if we look at break it into maybe almost four different categories. So at the top of the category is Campina Friesland. And there, over that period, they paid a milk price of 35.22 centilitre. And that's based on a fat of 4.2% and a protein of 3.4% using the LTO comparison. And those prices are exclusive of that. So I suppose when we look at it, we can see that they're, by far ahead of all the rest of the I suppose, companies or countries, about 5.4 centilitre ahead of Ireland. So that's a big difference between Campina Friesland and Ireland. So that's out in front. If we look at the second league, then the second league, there's probably three that can be put into that second league, or four. Basically, what you have is Arla in Denmark, you have Danone in France, and Lactalis in France. So they're kind of heading around the 33 centilitre. That's kind of, up or down, that's where they are. So they're approximately 3.1, 3.2 centilitre ahead of Ireland. And then you get down to, the likes of Muller and DMK in Germany, and they're about a centilitre ahead of Ireland. So of that comparison, Ireland came out at about 29.8 centilitre. Essentially you have the Campina Friesland, 35.22. You have the others, the other Arla stroke the French companies at about 33 and the German companies at about 31. Below Ireland, then you have Fonterra, and Fonterra was at 28.1 cent per litre. So that was about 1.7 centilitre below Ireland in that comparison.
And, looking to the balance of that. And I guess you talk about profitability, and naturally, milk price has a huge impact on profitability, but the other side of the scale and the balance is costs of production. And you've referred to, Ireland chasing this seasonal system, in terms of to take advantage and exploit grass growth. Where are our costs relative to, the counterparts that you're mentioning there on the table?
Okay, so essentially, what we did then in terms of, and this was based on work that Fiona Thorne had done, but I suppose what we did then was we took the European countries in that list. And the reason why we only stuck with the European countries is because they're part of a Flattening network, which is essentially the European version of the National Farm Survey that we're aware of here in Ireland, which is run by Teagasc and is monitoring farm performance, financial, and I suppose a lot more since 1972. So it's a very strong, very robust database. So what we did was we took that database and looked at I suppose cost production in the different countries. Now, I suppose just to make the point at the start, we used a process called cash cost plus depreciation, which essentially means that we had the cash costs in each country, and we also put depreciation on top of it. We didn't include owned labor, or we didn't look at total economic costs, which would give you a return to owned land and labor. Just to make that point, and we can talk a little bit about that after maybe. But so every country was treated in the same way. So that's really important. So every country owned land or labor was not included in the calculation. So I suppose when we look at the likes of the highest cost country over that period, 2014, 2019, was Denmark. It came out at 38 cent a litre. The Netherlands came out at 35 cent a litre. France came out at 32 cent a litre. And UK at about 30 cent a litre. And Ireland came in there at 24 cent a litre. So, massive variation between countries. And obviously that has huge implications in terms of overall profitability. So I suppose, again, to make the point that owned labour wasn't included or owned land values, but subsequent to when the report was done, we also looked at the numbers. If we had put in a cost for owned labour and owned land, and for those countries, Denmark, Germany, France, Ireland, the UK, when we looked at it, Ireland still came out the most profitable over that period of time from when we do include a charge in those figures.
And to take it a step further then and really delve into the seasonality, can you quantify the impact of seasonality on the industry, here and relative to, the farms on the continent where they're operating at a more flatter curve?
Yeah, so I suppose, again, that was an interesting, it was something that we were really interested in, is to look at what is the implications for seasonality. Because, I suppose there is a lot of, or has been over the years, to be honest, until very recently, there was virtually, little enough comment on it. But over the years, there has been a lot of discussion. Have we the right model? Are we right to stick with the seasonal curve? What is the implication? So we wanted to get a little bit under the hood of that and see what the implications were. So first of all, if we look at, there's a kind of a term called, when we look at processing capacity, it's called capacity utilization, which is essentially a calculation that shows, how well we're using our processing capacity. And if we look at some of the European countries, they work at a figure of, somewhere around 90%, even above 90%. So essentially what that means is that their processing capacity is close to fully utilized all year round, which is obviously has implications in terms of the requirement for capital when additional expansion happens. It has implications for running costs. It has implications for depreciation. Whereas to compare Ireland in that same boat, we're at about 62% in terms of capacity utilization in the country. So we use our capacity, our processing capacity, up to 62%. And that's because we have a seasonal curve peaking somewhere around 14% in May, And in the December, January months, there's 1 to 2%. So very little milk produced over those months. And that has, I suppose, implications around the additional requirements for processing capacity and so on as we expand. So I suppose that's the first thing. That's where we are in terms of capacity utilization. One important note is that that has actually improved over the last 4 or 5 years. So with the relaxation of quotas, what we're seeing here is that the shoulders are building up. We're looking at calving date. If we look again over the last 5 or 6 years, calving date has moved back from, on average, mean calving date was somewhere around 6th, 7th of March, maybe 2013, 14, and that's now back to around about 28th of February. So there is again movement at farm level back in terms of calving date. So I suppose what are the implications from a seasonality and from a curve that looks like that? And I suppose what we did was we looked at a piece of work that we did a number of years ago, and we kind of updated that based on where we are today. And essentially what we showed from that was that about 1.3 cent or 1.4 cent a litre if we flatten our curve, not flatten. So what we did was we compared a seasonal calving, so a spring calving system, to a system where we calve 50% in the autumn and 50% in the spring. When we do that, our seasonal calving, as I've said just a minute ago, our seasonal calving curve peaks in May at about 14%, whereas our split 50-50 calving system peaks in April at approximately 12%. So, that's, you'd have imagined with a lot more cows calving in the autumn that your peaks, that you'd have flattened the curve even more, but you don't. In essence, to get a European curve, we'd have to calf all year round, which again is something that we don't want to do. But just to look at it in terms of, capacity utilization, when we look at capacity utilization, as I've said, about 62%. Currently, if we move to 50-50 spring autumn, that capacity utilization would go up to about 70%. The implications for that then are milk price would go up by about 1.3, 1.4 cent a litre.
And where do you expect costs to go there, Laurence? You're going to see an increase in your milk revenue of 1.3, 1.4 and implications for cost?
Yeah, so, and that's probably the most important thing. All our analysis shows us that to compare the two of those, costs will go up by about 3 cent a litre. So what we're saying here is that there would be a reduction in profit to move to that split calving system to the tune of 1.6 cent a litre. And I think what's really, really important is, yes, there will be a higher milk price. So, we'd be able to pay a higher milk price. The industry would be able to pay a higher milk price. That's clear. But the problem is that profitability at farm level would be reduced. Scale it up to where we are today at roughly 8 billion litres, it's worth about 130 million euros a year to stay with where we are rather than trying to flatten the curve. So I suppose, importantly, the curve calving down, calving cows to grass supply, matching feed demand and feed supply is still the key direction for the industry going forward, and that's something that we'll have to focus on. I suppose there is little things we could do in terms of calving pattern. We're somewhere around the 28th of February now. There is, our analysis tells us that the optimum calving date for most of the country is probably mid-February. So there is scope to tidy up the curve further. There's scope, to increase the fertility of the herd. Nationally, we're at about 65% 6-week calving rate. The target is 90. So there's lots of progress we can still make within the spring calving model, but the spring calving model is going to be the most profitable.
And looking then to expansion, Laurence, how do we compare with our European counterparts? You mentioned the removal of milk quotas. We've seen a significant expansion in Ireland. How does that compare to the continent?
Yeah, sure. I suppose in reality, if we look at all the studies that were done before milk quotas were removed, the narrative was, and this was an EU statement probably back in 2008, 2009, where they said that they wanted milk production to move to areas of competitive advantage. And essentially that's in essence what has happened. We've had significant expansion in Ireland, and to a large degree, some expansion in Europe, not saying, there has been, but the percentage-wise increases have been much higher in Ireland than in some of the other countries, So, and that's I suppose because of our cost base. I suppose even if we go back to 2008-9, when it was flagged that milk quotas were going to be gone in 2015, essentially you could see at that point that farmers were getting ready. And if you look at the number of replacement heifers being born then relative to 2 or 3 years before that, they dramatically increased over that period. And farmers, I suppose, started to ramp up almost to the tune, a little bit too early, because, obviously there was milk or super levy issues back then in, 14, 15, 13 even, in the exit strategy for milk quota. So obviously that had implications.
From your knowledge and your work with modelling and, interacting with the National Farm Survey and, the expansion that we have experienced in Ireland, is it the right thing going forward to continue on with our seasonality? Like, I mean, I know you've, as you've said, you've modelled a 50-50 and it will lead to a higher cost and a higher milk price. The higher costs outweigh the milk price. But is this the right thing to do? Or, should we aim to flatten the curve a bit?
So, based on my analysis and based on anything that I've seen, absolutely, it's the only model that we should stay with is that spring calving model, because there's a number of reasons. One, we don't have, our competitive advantage is around being able to grow grass, be able to utilize high quantities of that grass, and to be honest, farmers have really honed that, and they're really good at it. So moving away from that to something that we don't have an advantage in. We don't have, we're not able to grow massive crops of maize and massive other feeds. We can't, we're not likes of, continental Europe where we can grow big crops of other feeds. We don't have a Rotterdam where you can bring in lots of grain at a relatively cheap cost because of that the port side of it. So we don't have a comparative advantage in any of those other areas except in grass-based milk production. So to move away from that, in my opinion, would not be wise move at all. So we need to be really, really, really careful. We need to stick with the curve. And there's a lot of narrative around milk yields and all that at the moment in terms of organic N or whatever. And again, if you look at it, the higher the milk yields, the higher the organic N. So that'll reduce our stocking rate. So if we increase our organic N because we drive milk yield faster, our stocking rate will reduce faster. So it doesn't really make sense to bring in feed from, for example, South America. If we look at sustainability, does it make sense to bring in feed from South America to produce milk that can be converted to powder to send to some other part of the world? Probably not. So we have to make use with what we have, and that's a grass-based system.
And let's go down that route, Laurence. You mentioned that increasing that feed that we're importing in will invariably reduce the stocking rate and the number of cows we have in the country. Do you see other environmental implications for moving to that less seasonal system?
We do, and again, an important point to make, again, there's a lot of narrative out there around the expansion in dairy industry, and we're just passing the dairy cow numbers today that were in place in 1984 when milk quotas came in. So, talk about running faster to stand still. So now we're just where we were in 1984 with cow numbers, or just slightly ahead of it now. So just, there is a lot of discussion around cow numbers and so on. In the last, 6 or 7 years, that's all that's happened. We've just got back to where we were in 1984. So I suppose just looking at our grass-based system and essentially what we're trying to do, I suppose we're trying to produce a human edible protein from something that's inedible, which is grazed grass. And that's probably, if we stand back and look at food security, and if we look at, consumption patterns globally and what's going to happen, the more that we convert a human edible feed into something that's human edible, it's obviously a lot easier to stand over that system. So that's what grass-based systems do in the long term. Where animals are fed feeds that humans can eat, there may be question marks over the system, and that's something we need to think about in the direction of travel that we're going in. Going back to, I suppose, how sustainable our system is compared to if we were to move away. So essentially what we would say that, and based on the modeling work that we've done, if we were to move to, let's say, a non-seasonal production system or a split calving system, our analysis tells us that the carbon footprint of that milk would be somewhere between 10, 12, 13% higher. So what essentially we do is we'd be moving to a system that's less sustainable from a carbon footprint point of view. If we look at it, there'd be more indoor feeding, so there'd be probably more ammonia, more slurry production. Virtually every one of the metrics that you'd be looking at in terms of, greenhouse gases, ammonia, even if we look at the proportion of the diet that would be human edible of the animal, would increase as well. So virtually every metric that you'd look at would deteriorate if we move to a split calving or more split calving in our system. So from an environmental point of view, you'd have to say it wouldn't be good from a sustainability point of view.
And as a slightly side point, Laurence, on that, you're referring to dairy cow numbers in 1984. And if we compare the cow of today versus the cow from back then, and I guess even more recently, since the abolition of milk quotas, you mentioned that there is an increase in supply in the shoulder years. And I just talk through that and I guess the reasoning for that. So I guess two parts to that question. Firstly, the cow of 1984 versus now. And then secondly, what has happened in terms of production since the abolition of milk quotas on a per cow basis.
Okay, so I suppose just looking at, since the relaxation of quotas, what we can see is that since between 2014 and 2019, milk solids per cow has increased by about 20%. So that's a fairly, substantial increase over a relatively short period. And even if we just look between 2010, the food harvest reference period was 2007 to 2009. And if we look at how milk yield has changed and over that period up to 2019, you're talking about roughly 100 kilos of an increase in milk solids per cow, or an increase of, roughly about 33%, which is absolutely huge. I suppose what we can say here is that, in the quota periods, milk production per cow has been constricted, and that was being constricted by a number of reasons. Shorter lactations, I suppose cows being restricted at grass because the feed, if you fed, you were facing into a super levy fine. So these are things that were reducing production, were reducing efficiency of the system. When they're relaxed, obviously that has strong implications for the output. Going back to 1984, and I'm only guessing here, Emma-Louise, I think we were somewhere just north of 3,000 litres per cow in terms of output, with probably protein and fat somewhere around 3.2 and 3.6, or maybe 3.5. And I'm just guessing those numbers, but absolutely huge productivity increases since then.
And I guess, we had planned to have this conversation in May, in and around peak, but I guess factors within the industry have prompted us to have this conversation early. But I guess if we make reference to the current situation within Glanbia, are they looking to move, from the seasonal system to a kind of an all year round calving system?
So I suppose make reference to that. Essentially, what the Glanbia issue is around planning, from what we understand. So planning permission and certain objections, and that's slowing up the process to get planning. So from that point of view, I suppose, and it's really important that we understand that it's from that point of view, we're talking about any change to anything rather than a policy, because I would be really concerned if we were talking about maybe a processor-led discussion around policy of needing to produce milk over the winter. Then that would be a completely different debate, and we would have to be very clear that that's not the direction of the industry. And that's, we need to be crystal clear on that from a policy perspective, moving to more non-seasonal production does not make sense unless we have new products coming out of the woodwork that are telling us that'll justify paying that premium over those winter months that justify that winter milk production, which is, and those premiums, those products haven't been there, and it's probably less likely that those products will be there going forward. But who knows? Maybe they'll come. But those products have to justify the move. So is it planning or policy? So from a policy point of view, we'd be very concerned if that was the direction we were going in. From a planning point of view, I suppose that's a different debate. And I suppose the issue here, and you could think back and say, right, this is a bit like the quota regime, restricting production. And in essence, it's not, because from that quota perspective, we knew the timeframes. From 2007, 2008, when the notification was given, the quotas were gone in 2015. We knew what was going to happen. So farmers knew what they could plan. They were planning 6-7 years ahead, and as time went on, they were planning 3-4 years ahead, and as time went on, they were planning 1 year or 2 years ahead. But they could have a plan. The problem here is the time frame is very short, and people have actions on the ground that they're doing, and that has very strong implications for them and their systems.
And just to go down that route for a minute, Laurence, like you have highlighted that, farmers have improved technically, and you've quantified it in terms of calving date. They've pulled back their calving date and improved their fertility to align with grass growth. They have improved their milk solids production, and just in the last number of years, to a tune of 20%. And this is to match the seasonal system, to exploit what we have as an advantage in Ireland. And, as it stands, this is just a Glanbia issue and a Glanbia farmer, say, supplier issue. And, Glanbia are citing it as a temporary measure, so a 3-year measure. But I guess it is a firm reminder of milk quota times from an Irish farmer perspective. Do you see this sort of problem rearing its head for farmers, in the future? Like, is this something that we're going to be looking at and discussing in the longer term?
I suppose there's a bigger discussion, Emma-Louise, is going to happen in the background around, environmental policy and all that. That's almost separate, and it's probably not for today, but that's going to be there in the background as well. So my clear view is that we would be better to instead of moving away from the curve that we have in the long term, we'd be better off to stop. If these is problems that we're going to face down the road, why would you damage the efficiency of your system as a whole, to continue to expand? So we'd have to definitely rethink any industry expansion in the long term. If these were problems that we were going to face down the road, because we certainly don't want to damage what we have in terms of the efficiency of the seasonal system, and we need to be really careful of that. And perversely, some of these discussions that are going on around the Glanbia issue and planning actually are going to be deleterious from the environmental perspective, because any move away from, or any more milk that's produced in those winter months for even a short period is not good from the environmental perspective.
And looking then and putting yourself in the boots of these farmers who are currently in this situation, what is your advice to them? What can they do where they are constricted by the processing capacity?
So again, and again, noting the short-term nature of it, it's a very difficult situation to be in. And I suppose, this is something that we would have said down through the years across different fora. I suppose the first thing to do is to get your head around, how bad is the situation? So, I think from my understanding, there will be notification sent out from Glanbia in the next few days around, or has been sent out potentially on your processing, I suppose, capacity or whatever. And then it's really important then that farmers engage in the numbers and see what are the implications for each individual farm, and then to make a plan based on that. And for me, lots of suppliers will be very unhappy, but some tinkering with their system, whether it's reducing feed around peak, whether it's maybe putting some of the herd on once a day, little tinkering with the system will get them by for a 1, 2, 3 year period. But there probably are a cohort of farmers that are, dramatically affected, and for those farmers, then it's going to need a separate plan. And the first part of that plan for me is around doing a cash flow and looking at the implications for the business over the next 2 to 3 years, and getting a very clear picture on what are the implications of different scenarios, whether that's putting all the herd on once a day, or restricting supply at peak, or whatever the different scenarios are, to get a clear picture of what they are on the cash flow of the business, because that's where this is going to, I suppose, pass and fail. So, give you an example. So if you could, obviously this is not going to affect or not going to help the extreme situation, but take an individual farmer that, is restricted, but maybe not restricted to the tune of 50 or 60%. But if you think of a farmer that could reduce concentrate feed at peak over that period by, let's say they were feeding 4 kilos, 5 kilos last year at peak. If they reduce that by 3 kilos, let's say a response of 0.75 liters of milk per kilo of concentrate. And let's say they put maybe a quarter of the herd on once a day, because those animals were maybe in poor body condition score or had some sort of small issues with them. We know that once a day will reduce milk volume by about 26%, and solids by about 20%. So if they were to do that at peak, reduce kilos of concentrate by 3, put 25% of the herd on once a day, that would essentially reduce peak by about 15%. So, tweaks like that to the system, in conjunction with the small increases that they're getting, will probably help, the vast majority of the farmers over the system. Where the situation is much more extreme, again, as I say, case by case, individual cash flow first, and then look at the scenarios with somebody, Teagasc or a private consultant or whoever, to come up with the scenarios. And again, really important here that you start discussing these issues with somebody, doesn't matter who, because 2 heads are better than 1, and whether it's whatever the scenarios are, whatever the solutions are, it's really important that these problems are discussed.
I think that's a really good point, Laurence, in terms of, I guess it's easy with what's happening to bury your head in the sand, but a simple cash flow budget, and it's something that we can attach to the show notes. And as you say, your Teagasc advisor is also there to help and talk through some possible solutions to your situation. Thank you, Laurence.
No problem. Thank you, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Laurence Shalloo for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.